on behalf of the School of Architecture, but also the School of the Arts, which are both supporting the lecture tonight. And it makes perfect sense that Andrés is somewhere between the School of Architecture and the School of Art, probably in neither, but in the space between both perfectly. And of course, almost every architect imagines that they are artists, and I think there is this ambition for architects to sort of open up the world to new kinds of thinking that come from art. And most of architectural practice seems to be an expression of disappointment that this dream to be an artist is not realized, but it remains always there as a dream. And every now and then there are architects that seem to be fully operational within the world of architecture, but have transforms people's perception in the way that artists do. And Andrés is exactly such a figure, so perfectly logical. Not that you're interested in logic, that we are joined together, the School of Architecture and the School of Arts, to sort of welcome you tonight. All I will say just very briefly is that is for you to pay attention to the subtitle of the name of the office, Office for Political Innovation. So instead of sort of thinking to yourself, well, maybe architecture has some kind of key role in society, and therefore architecture operating as art, which is making you see society differently, would therefore be already political. Why not just say that your office is politically innovative from the beginning and make that the project, and then in reverse? So you might even say this is an office that works on political innovation and then finds out whether or not architecture comes as a result of that. Which means, of course, to rethink architectural practice, so it's an architectural practice that doesn't behave at all like an architectural practice. And in particular, it seems to me it uses the domesticity as a weapon. It understands domesticity not as safety, security, familiarity, etc., but quite the opposite, as a kind of destabilizing element. So it uses kind of tactical domesticities, and does so all around the world. There are projects everywhere, so basically all around the world, everywhere, domesticity. So at home, on the road, super interesting. I think if Cedric Price, maybe somebody that we both love, said that maybe the most important response of an architect to being invited to do a commission is to say, to not do the job, that it would actually be the most artistic and ethical responsibility. Perhaps Andrés might say that doing an opera is the right way to do a job. And so this is really a practice that goes from doing a house in which people will live, to doing an opera without the sense that there's necessarily a huge difference between those two activities. Now that's, of course, the dream, and by opera I don't mean soap opera, I mean real opera. So anyway, welcome to a room which I hope you feel is yours anyway, and it's super nice that you're teaching with us here in the school.
I have to put the password here. I don't know what's the password. I could try. Yes, enter. Okay. I'll try to make up. Sweet Home Riots. I'm going to be talking about this. Okay, I'm going to be talking of the work that is produced by a team, this one, and together with many other people. So actually, in many occasions, I'll be talking in plural, let's say, and that's what I'm referring. In the last years, we've been developing this kind of work that, as Mark is saying, is kind of, in a way, it's building, but also there are many other things. Here you see part of the work that we've produced, and as you see, many of the things that we do are kind of words or slogans, publications, kind of funny movies, even with the soap operas, even the operas, but also soap operas, and in Colombia, and well, many different things. This is an important diagram for me because what we're trying to do is to basically provide an outcome in the office that is symmetrical to the complexity, the technological complexity of the context in which we want to work. So because they're constructed with all these different technologies, we're trying to produce them so we can somehow be relevant there. I'm going to be talking about 4 things, so I'll go really fast. And if someone has any doubt, you can ask me at the end, or, I don't know, write me or find me in a corridor, and I will be very happy to attend anything that you want to, any question that you want to pose me. Okay, I would like to see this image. We were talking about decoration, and in my opinion, when we see of these kind of objects and the narratives they include, we could think that they're kind of irrelevant, but of course, many people would help saying that they're not so irrelevant. On the one hand, they're describing the world in a certain way, and by doing that, they're also projecting it. So they're both representing and producing the world and daily life in a very particular way. In all these things, we could find cosmopolitics, we could find social structures, we could find politics, we could find hierarchies, we could find many, many different things, exclusions, for instance, and we do it in a very particular way. So I could suggest that these things are doing politics. And we could find that in very different fashions, and we could find that happening in many architectures that we are tending to consider from other perspectives. Wow, a new thing happened here. Do you want to allow the following program to make changes? No. Okay. But it's not there anymore. So, well, it will come up at some point. Okay. Do I have to do anything? Okay. Okay, it's there. A few years ago, in the Venice Biennale, in the year that Kazuyo Sejima was directing it, we presented kind of a decoration project. And I wanted to bring it the first one because it's probably the most decorative thing that I've done. And it has to do with Christmas trees, with table settings, with many things that we're very used to see happening and even taking part on. We used to take part on them. And we were actually producing kind of a Christmas tree. But the Christmas tree was actually a map that was mapping the political dimension of domestic interior that we studied in Madrid. This one over here, in which decoration, again, is not, let's say, something that is not playing a political role. This is a shared home that is shared by students from the university, and kind of producing this interior in a way that is getting together people oriented on a certain sensitivities. And it's producing meetings in which, let's say, that decoration is also producing a feeling, an atmosphere in which people get to have the opportunity to share a beginning, let's say, or a frame in which conversations are produced from a certain, let's say, perspective. For instance, the furniture that you see here, everything's been found somewhere. Like nothing is being bought. And that's kind of a statement of the people living here, but because they were kind of feeling or sharing this sensitivity against consumerism. I mean, this could be seen as something very basic, but let's say that is a tiny example of how these things are not just describing life in a particular way, are not just making it cuter or whatever, it's also engaging people in a certain way. And by doing these mediations, it's kind of playing a political role. When we see, this is the reconstruction we did of the house with all the elements that I was describing and many others. And this is another way of accounting for the house. This is the amount of pieces or the units of landscape that are required to make the life of this house in the way that is produced daily possible. The amount of water, the amount of industry, the amount of advertisement, the amount of parliamentarism that somehow is activated or required in the daily life of these people. This is another image. This is a diagram in which we were tracing the controversies, the institutions, the regulations, the activisms that get to be performed in the house. So all the polemics that get to be discussed or in which the daily life of the house get to participate, or not all, but a few of them are included in this diagram. For me, these are three different ways of describing the same. I don't know if you're familiar with the statement that the Prime Minister Erdogan did a few days ago that was in the papers, in which he said this: "It's not clear what's going on in these places. They are all mixed up. Anything can happen. This is not being checked. As a conservative democratic government, we have to intervene." He was talking basically about shared houses shared by students. And he was saying that somehow, as part of his responsibility, political responsibility, he included the task of controlling what was going on there. Because as he said, it's not clear what's going on in these places. They are all mixed up. Anything can happen. This is not being checked. This is actually part of the discussion also in Europe now, in which the terms in which Erasmus program is happening are going to be reviewed. And they're going to be transformed according to many different issues that have to do with austerity, but also what happened in those places. Are they really doing the best of the resources? Is party something that should be paid with public funding? All this kind of discussion is bringing politics into a very particular place. Shared homes, shared apartments that we tend to think that are apolitical spaces. A few years ago, we developed this project, which is the Rolling House for the Rolling Society. It was the result of invitation that the Mies van der Rohe Foundation did. And they are doing every year a series of apartments, like prototypes of possible innovative apartments. We were asked to do an apartment for a bachelor that was kind of with high incomes, and that was a very urban person, and that, I don't know, something similar to American Gigolo, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many apartments for this kind of person. So we were not so happy doing it. It's already done, let's say. So we proposed to do something else. To think of what could be the way architecture could become relevant in the making of shared homes, like the ones that I was showing you before. And to do that, it's kind of a hard task, because it's basically an architecture that tends to happen, or an urbanism, I would call it, that happens in apartments that have been designed thinking of a different social model. So apartments that were initially designed for, let's say, families, end up being used by this kind of bunch of people living together. It's a very diverse issue or reality, because it involves, of course, students, but also transnational workers, old ladies that have a huge house but a very small pension, and they decide to rent rooms for whatever, young workers. All these different ways of performing it were part of the research that we developed. And, well, I will show you just a few things, but this is one of the cases. And it was also something very interesting is that the way politics get to be performed here are kind of different to the ones that we could consider that happen in other places, like street, for instance. And also, the way the discipline, or the issues that are discipline architecture, urbanism, deals with many realities, were challenged by the knowledge and the wisdom that we could find in these places, or some of them. It's a huge reality. For instance, only in the European Union, we found that there were more than 80 million people living in shared homes, and that altogether, they were much more than most of the most important European cities together. What is also interesting for me is that even though architects tend to think that a way of doing a better kitchen is to have a built-out kitchen, in these places, improvement in kitchens was slightly different. So, for instance, in the conversations that we recorded with people living in these kind of apartments, they were saying that much more important than a nice, well-designed, optimized, efficient kitchen, like a built-out one, it would be to actually distribute equalitarily the task of doing the dishes. And that was much more desired. Or, for instance, we could see that actual diversity was a value that could be very much, let's say, desired by people living in places like this. Or another thing that challenged some of the options that architects tend to think like good ones, like optimization was challenged by the fact that in these homes, redundancy is so much important. So the fact that each one could have one of these places to hang their clothes to dry was much better than have a very good one hanger place. So redundancy was much more desired than optimization. And we could go on with the idea of familiarity. And we could see in many of these conversations that differential was considered a source of sweet comfort, whereas in, let's say, popular accounts of what is a familiar life like, is considered a part of the making of comfort, sweet comfort. With this, we designed kind of tissue, I would call it, of kind of prototypes of these apartments that was trying to make the best of what we get to learn, like seeing these different things. And we constructed this prototype with the help of a number of industries that were kind of putting many of the resources to develop some of the products, and most of the time to find ways of reassemble their products in a way that could perform differently. So it's something that I'm very much interested in, how to take the margins or the marginal parts of technology and reassembling them in a way that they could gain a different performance. Okay, this is the way it looks, which is not that important, and this is the way it could emerge, we proposed in different cities. But actually, this is the plan that I'm interested in. This is the one I like. Because it's actually showing what could be kind of the performance of this architecture. And in this, we don't only see the, let's say, architectural devices, the proper ones, but we see it performing in association with many other things. So the role in society could only work if we take into account how the material devices get together in a very particular way, and how different technologies could bring together a possibility for a society to be developed like this. We found, for instance, that there were technologies that were so much required, like, for instance, channels of spatial continuity, like the ones you see there, or, for instance, devices for simultaneous, to bring simultaneous spaces together in a simultaneity experience. Or, for instance, things like shared, ongoing, constructed constructed narratives from very respected ones, let's say, like literature, but also things that could be seen as banal, like the gossip magazines, like Hola, Hello, for instance, or soap operas or things like that, that when we consider in their contents, they might seem kind of funny or not so important, but when we see their social performance, then they gain a great importance. And, of course, projections, like as big as transnational workers saving to get a home in, I don't know, Quito, or let's say the project, the micro project of saving money to go to a concert in Berlin, for instance. 2, from cities to urban enactments. I really love this song. Everyone knows it? Yeah? It's kind of reprogrammed and all the time. This is actually a photograph of this 1974 pilot episode of The Little House in the Prairie. Many people probably saw it the first time, and many others see it even now. You know, you go to a hotel and you play the TV, and the Ingalls there again. So many years afterwards. So for me, it's very interesting, this photograph, because it's the one that was broadcasted and, let's say, distributed massively to advertise the show. And it's a very particular photograph. What we see at the front, this kind of social construction that we could call the family, or the blood-bonded family, or something like that. And the architecture is very particular. So we see that family is something directly related to a single architectural device, the house. And actually, this is the house, because it's got everything: the fireplace, the pitch roof, everything, the tree, everything. Okay. When we see this image, which is also from the pilot episode, it's kind of peculiar. I love this photograph because Caroline, the mother, is wearing this Victorian dress, and with this flower pattern and the ribbon and everything, you know. But what is wearing her daughter? Another Victorian dress with a similar dress pattern. And what is wearing her daughter's doll? The same dress, the Victorian dress with flower pattern. The ribbon is not there, but well, I mean, this is kind of steps of the same. This is another image that I'm very interested in. This is an image in which Charles, the father, is kind of opening the door, like in the Meninas, Velázquez Meninas. They're surprised, by this one that is behind us. And they're looking with this face of where's the camera? And who's watching? Is Charles. What's watching? A very particular thing. So it's this rhetoric in which we see that something's important because something's watching it. And it's important because what Caroline and the two daughters are doing is precisely one of the big things or the roles of this link between family and architectural device, the house. They're learning, the two daughters, from their mother how to set the table. This is the one I really love. And this is not from the pilot episode. This is actually from season number 6. Again, Charles is watching, like always. It's not helping. He's not doing her part of the task like in the shared homes. But he's watching and reading a book. And the mother is, again, teaching Laura to reproduce daily knowledge. She's teaching her to dress actually what's the Victorian dress. And what is really crazy about this, and you can find in the discussions in the internet, the real experts on this show are discussing all day long in blogs all around, and they found out something which for me is really amazing. The dress that Laura is sewing, and is taught to be sewing by her mother, is the very same dress that Caroline was wearing in the first pilot episode. So this is kind of a crazy thing. Like they're going back to the past, and Laura is producing the very dress that the mother was wearing in the first episode when Laura was much younger. So this is very interesting because for me, there's this idea that knowledge gets passed from mothers to daughters and to dolls and to new daughters and new mothers and this, unchallenged. So the same dress is going to be reproduced and reproduced and reproduced in a very specific architectural device that is the house. And the house is kind of fixing this knowledge because it's producing this homey environment in which, let's say, the particular condition that is socially produced is familiarity. And familiarity is not only that these genes around, the same genes around, but also the fact that knowledge kind of is fixed in a very particular way. This is also from 1974, so something happened in 1974, which I don't know. Something must have happened. And we reproduce the same rhetoric. Family or kind of familiarity, in this case, interspecies familiarity. But this architectural device, which is particularly similar to the one we saw before. But in this case, you know Heidi, Girl of the Alps? Yeah? It's also reprogrammed all the time, so yeah. It's something else added. When we see, you know the story of the grandfather that was supposed to have done something awful in the past, and he has to kind of hide away there in the mountains, and the daughter is, well, the granddaughter is sent with her. Well, what is interesting for me is that they're watching the city. They're watching society from outside. So the house is the place that provides the opportunity in these rhetorics of seeing society and kind of the urban from outside. So on the one hand, we have this place, the home, and then we have down there society and urban and all those things that the grandfather doesn't like that much. And this second idea that once you're at home, you're super comfortable. You can actually even feel free not to follow the social conventions and kind of escape from normativity in a way. And you produce your own rules, so you can freely move around in your underwear like Heidi is doing here and enjoying it. 1974 is, again, is one of these funny things. Like, it's the year that IKEA opened the first store in Tokyo, and for many people who are studying the IKEA phenomenon, let's call it, it's the year of the international global expansion of IKEA, and this is the Tokyo shop. Okay, when we see IKEA advertisement, something of this is repeated. So this idea that once you get at home, you don't have to wear your high heels. This idea that your home is either, I mean, here is your kingdom. But they have some confusion here because here is your kingdom and at the same time your republic. So it's kind of mixing many possibilities. So home is really so good. This is again Kingdom and Republic. But anyway, it's clear that it's yours. So politically, it's yours. So we tried not to follow this, and we did this project that was called IKEA Disobedients 3 years ago. And that was actually about challenging this notion that once you get at home, you get disconnected from political battles or whatever activity. And actually that we were trying to see that domestic spaces is actually very much politically active. And that this distinction between the making of society and the making of these environments of familiarity in which you leave politics, let's say, out of the door, it's kind of challenged by many notions or many experiences that we could see every day. This is, for instance, one of the cases that we included in this archive. Candela lives with her, I will read the way we presented her. Candela lives with her 3 daughters, her grandchildren, and 6 dogs in an old apartment in the Lavapiés district in Madrid. A number of elderly male neighbors living on their own regularly have dinner at Candela's place. Social networks based on solidarity flourish at such gatherings. Or, for instance, this one that I particularly am interested on. This is Berta at that moment. Now it's Theo. She was already going through a process of gender reassignation, and she could, in her words, she could do that by the way she engaged with a very particular place, a house that was a squat in Madrid, Lavapiés, inhabited only by people, especially by women, that were in a process of defining the way they relate to their gender. This kind of place, this home, in a way, was very much a political project. And it was actually the center of the political projects of many people that were convinced that if they could get together and construct this kind of architecture and urbanism, they could gain so empowerment that could somehow transform the way their citizenship could be performed. We gathered many of these testimonies and cases, and we studied their architecture and the way they were doing things at home that were actually not providing them an independent republic, but actually very much a device that would allow them to really engage with the transformation of the shared domains, and that were actually part of a project that could never happen with the way without the way they were constructing their relationship with architecture, and in which architecture has a very specific agency also played. This project was bought by MoMA, and we were asked to find people in New York that were doing similar projects, or at least projects that were engaging with politics, again, from the intimacy, let's say, and the openness of their homes. For instance, Modi in Long Island City transformed her living room into a hairdresser's salon. And it's very interesting for me to see, when we were interviewing her to prepare this project, that actually many of the people that were taking part in these sessions or in the daily life of this salon would meet each other, even though they were living in the neighborhood for years, they could have met each other in this kind of interior or domestic interior that was kind of producing a social space in which association, debate, controversies could be handled as part of the construction of a collective life. Or, well, I don't want to go too much into the details, but this Mama Gina transformed the kitchen of her restaurant into a place that was at some point domestic, because it was the place that her daughters in which her sons were spending every single afternoon after school, so they would be there with the cooks and everyone, and they would kind of bring domesticity into this space. And by doing that, she was gaining the opportunity of, let's say, keeping working without the resources of having a babysitter. Or these people that is engaging with LGBT project in the, let's say, living room or the dining room of their place that they share. We did some kind of architectural constructions, but we did it with IKEA hacked furniture, like misattending or misregarding to the instructions that the mandates that they produce. And we were kind of disobedient IKEA, producing these places that could be prototypes of something that would be in between domestic space, this is in PS1, and kind of politically activated urban spaces, something that is both things at the same time, so it's bringing the notion that these things are not necessarily divorced. Okay, homes, domestic interiors, domestic constructions, domestic urbanisms, I would call them, is something that we've been doing so much of a field work. We've tried to take advantage of all the different invitations that we have to do experiments on this, and we had this invitation by the European Union to do something, and we decided to analyze these 96 cases of homes, interviewing all the people living in there, and detecting actually how extensive they got to be and how complex they were. Or for instance, we were invited to the One Biennale to do a prototype of something like a politically activated domestic space, this suite parliament home. And we were taking the opportunity to do some field work again and account for all these different Korean situations of shared homes or banks or domestic spaces that were playing very particular political roles, and that we could do a catalog out of them. Or for instance, recently we were invited to do something in LA by REDCAT, and we produced an installation with a series of domestic ecosystems that were kind of producing urbanity and urbanism out of things that people do in their gardens, like this guy that is having this, well, it's an amazing story, but I don't know. If someone is so interested, I will be super available to explain it to. Or these jacuzzi riots that I really love this story, that these people use the bubble, the real estate bubble to buy, with the credit potential they gained, to buy a jacuzzi that is down there in the blue thing that they never use, but it's so interesting. Well, Malibu, yeah, everything. But what is interesting for me is once you get to see these things, also new possibilities for architecture and new, let's say, challenges for our discipline emerge. This is a case that we studied very much in detail. It's a shared home again, which is inhabited by 5 males, young males, from the Mourid Brotherhood from Senegal, all of them coming from Touba. And the house is in the Lavapiés neighborhood in Madrid. And it's a tiny home, actually. It's a studio, what is called a studio, with 2 rooms. One of them's got the kitchen in it, and the other is kind of a bedroom. And they transformed the part of the closet, so it's another bedroom. And this is the reconstruction with all of this shared home. And we could never really take into account what happens there as a domesticity without considering that this device is working only in association with, let's say, a series of other architectural devices. Like, for instance, this tiny grocery shop, which is an African grocery shop, and the owners are also Mourid, and they also come from Touba, and they are able to work as ambassadors of the newcomers and the people that come to be part of this new community. Or, for instance, the mosques, like this one, which is happening in a tiny apartment, also in the same district, and which is kind of playing a key role on controlling and kind of watching these people, and also to bring it, let's say, together, and let's say to find opportunities also to communicate the behavior of the people living in Lavapiés to the people still living in Touba. Cell phones, like this one, are really important, and they could never work without the collaboration of telephone parlors, because the cell phones are very expensive. So when someone from Touba wants to talk to someone in Madrid, they make a phone call, but no one answers, and they run to the phone parlor, and they call from here, which is much cheaper, and they have then a channel of communication with the women, people with discapacities, children, elder people staying in Touba. So actually and even other apartments, when there's a controversy in one of the apartments, the only way to resolve it is to move that person that is in the middle of the conflict to another apartment, so it works really as a network of so many different devices. When you account for this, this is what you see, in a way. And actually, we account for it now. It's totally different because it's a very evolving reality, and even it's multiple, so it depends on how you narrate it. You could include other things or not. It's not continual. I mean, it's not. It's fragmented and it's distributed in space, and it only gets to be together as it is performed. So it's an urbanism that somehow is challenging many of the readings that we've done of cities. And this is actually something that for me is very, very interesting, and I try to work on this. So when we talk about the urban, we tend to identify it with a very specific territorial and constructed form, the city. And in the last years, I've been trying to work with the possibility of thinking that instead of city, what would happen if we talk of the urban, instead of talking of the city, especially as a fixed patch in the land, to talk about urban enactments. And urban enactments could then somehow get conceptualized something that we could find in many of the cases that we've studied, that these elder people house, or this, for instance, this domesticity that is happening simultaneously on and offline, or this Hare Krishna reality that is at the same time kind of fictional and, let's say, on and offline also. And at the end, we could see that altogether it could bring this kind of image that is all the time transforming, and in which, let's say, that the perspective to make architecture relevant somehow needs to be a little bit developed. I think there's a series of ideas that have been developed in the STS environment that are kind of been useful for me to work with this and for us, for my office and everyone around. The first is that maybe the urban is something that is a composition of associated heterogeneous entities. So architecture in these constructions might not be just a single device like the house, like in the Ingalls place, but actually a constellation of many different things, technologies of very different nature, let's say. The second thing is that we could see that they only get constructed as they get to be performed. So a performative turn in its account and in its projection somehow could help. Also that the idea of how society relates to this thing, to these urban enactments, could be a little bit challenging. Some ideas that are circulating very intensively, both consciously and unconsciously, in the architectural, let's say, discourses. So maybe technology and society are not independent agencies, but they could be accounted as techno-societies. Of course, these are not necessarily ideas that I've been designing, so I always put the authors there. If anyone's got any doubt where they come from, you can ask me, and I will very happy tell you the sources of everything. The other thing is that there's no possibility for neutrality, technological neutrality, so architectural devices are not necessarily neutral, but neither there's a possibility of thinking techno-determinism, so a very specific device. It's not necessarily defining altogether the way it's going to be performed. But there's something of a shared agenda among all the different actors that get to be included in these urban enactments. So this is basically what in the studio we've been doing. First in summer with the superpowering urban enactments, in which we were working with places like this, like AA. So important in the making of the urban, even though the architectural devices might look a little bit basic, but they're not when you see the whole extension they get to have. Or, for instance, these places like Bingo business, that again, they're kind of very basic in their design, but they're not basic in the way they get to perform an urban reality. Or mosque, that I talked already about them, or gyms, this one is really amazing, or community TVs, or nail salons that I really love, and well, some people were working on this. Funeral homes that Andrés was developing, for instance, and actually funeral homes were really amazing. Andrés Matera, this amazing work in which we get to see how also funerals were part of a huge enactment that involved hospitals, mosques, churches, synagogues, universities, cars circulating, coming from Connecticut to bring corpse into the embalming room in the basement. And, well, Andrés did this amazing work. Or, for instance, Emily, that worked on this other enactment, in which she was working with how appliances were kind of reused in New York and circulating all around, and she superpowered it with this amazing project. And now we're working with Suite Home Urbanism, which is kind of similar, but with domestic spaces. And many people are doing amazing works, like Mintra, that is doing this thing with the storage places here in New York. And this one. Or SAC, that Adelson, that is working with this, the micro moment, like 10 minutes transaction between a financial advisor living in a loft in Williamsburg and talking with his clients living in uptown Manhattan and doing operations that end up having producing transformations in gold mines in South Africa. All this is happening in a kind of network similar to the one that is depicted there. Or this work that Jose Bruno is developing, the Queer Village, in which all the enactments around the Christopher Street community and the Grindr apps and all the different ways of performing queer realities and gay interaction are kind of considered as an urbanism, as a layered urbanism that is producing challenges both for the city of New York and for our discipline that are going to be exploding in an amazing work. 3. No happy endings. And this is a very important thing for me. So I was saying that architecture for me is social rendering in a way. And I mean it. And renderings are very important. And I mean, this is considered kind of not such an important architecture rendering, but it is. Because it's produced by Howard Digitals, that is one of the main companies in the rendering production in the world. And this is one of the masterpieces. And actually it is, because it's very sophisticated when we see how society is rendered here. So where are we now? According to this render, we're like on this boat, this sailing boat. You see the railing here? And we are automatically driven to this situation in which kind of wealthy people on vacations, on a sunny day, or in a sunny day, and on top of this boat. What do we have in between the architecture and ourselves? We see this kind of promise of romance going on here, and actually in the rhetorics, in the classical pictorial rhetorics, we even see the ending. Like, this is happening here, but we also see the horizon of what will happen here. And so we know that there's going to be a happy ending for this, by means of this architectural rendering that is so promising for everyone. Okay. So actually, architectural renderings are a little bit like this, like Pretty Woman. And when we see what is that society that architectural renderings are producing, it's kind of this reconciliation of the difference. So even though, I mean, a sex worker could be married or whatever, marrying, and being super happy with this yuppie that was super boring, and they together, they could bring this super nice existence without any conflict, and they could enjoy it. For me, it's kind of a little bit more complex. This is an image of a building that we designed, or I mean, we intervened. This is well, not this one. I mean, we redesigned it, or we transformed it. This is a photograph from the 50s, and you see, like, this is the result of a competition that we won, and it's called the Clergy House in Placencia, and these photographs were taken in the moment that the original building, this 15th century, let's say, whatever, palace, was used as a minor seminar, like from Roman Catholic Church. So it was the place that people around, males from like around 12 years old, were coming here, and they were starting to get a training to become priests in the future. I mean, this is kind of too exaggerated, but I prefer this one. This is kind of bringing an idea of what was the goal of this daily performance. So let's say that this looks like the Almodóvar La Mala Educación, the bad manners or whatever, I don't know what's, or the bad education or whatever. And it's actually not an accident. These two photographs are showing very, very precisely what was the daily life of this place. And actually, the way the program or the calendar was organized to produce actually a unification, or let's say similar bodies and minds within the people happening to be being part of this enactment, was something in which architecture was playing a role. This is the floor plan of the dormitories as they were designed and constructed here, and they were used like this in the moments that the photographs were taken. In each of these cells, there was one bed, and each one of the children or the childs living here were kind of sleeping in this place. There were no doors, and there was a corridor around it that was left for a priest every night to go around and watch what was the behavior of the people in these bedrooms, and to avoid any kind of misbehavior. I'm not saying that this was totally successful. Probably they knew ways of subverting all this construction, but in a way, the architecture had an agency here, or was playing kind of a role in the reproduction of this situation. Within time, let's say that the Roman Catholic Church in Spain is not needing those many seminars anymore. There's not so many people willing to become priests when they're 12, but they have many old people. So they need elder residencies, and they are using these buildings, they're transforming them, and they're organizing competitions. So we ran to do this competition, we won it, and we constructed it. This is the way it looks now, or at least it was the way it looked a few years ago when it was after 1 year of its completion. This is another image of the new part, and it was very popular, this image, in the local papers because there was kind of a controversy. Many people thought that this looked like a whorehouse. So the comment in the paper was, what a whorehouse the priests did for themselves. And which I think is nothing bad, there's nothing bad about that, but well, this is another image. This is another one. This is the chapel, actually. This is the garden. This is actually the water in case of fire. This water is taken and distributed all around. This is the chapel that was the world first self-service chapel that has ever been designed. I mean, that's at least what I think it is. Because since they all were playing the possibility of doing mass, or they have this possibility of doing mass, the chapel could be a self-service one. And, well, I'm not going to get that much into that, but if anyone's interested, I'll be happy to respond. But what is very interesting for me to this talk is this set of toys. And these toys, I call them political toys. I would call them political toys because what they were is forcing, let's say, people here, in order to make the building work, to take decisions, and not any decision, but in many moments, risky decisions that could make them emerge, let's say, like people with an opinion that could have to be confronted with those of others. I was thinking when doing these things, and we were discussing that maybe they could play a role similar to remote controls, or, when you are changing the channel and you're with other people in the living room, there's always this emergency of disputes in which someone starts to say, well, we should do this, or we should watch this other thing. And I always remember my sister that always wanted to watch the soccer match, and I always wanted to see something else, more fun. And she would say that, well, you cannot record soccer. And I would say, yeah, but it's so boring, whatever, who cares, and whatever. Now it's even more, with a number of new technologies that are very basic now for everyone. These discussions are kind of bringing together so many information that are helping also to, let's say, make daily life, in a way, charged with opportunities to discuss. And by discussing basic things, let's say ordinary things that many times we think that are so banal, we're actually making tiny statements that altogether could construct us as politically activated daily life people. And many technological constructions, like this website, for instance, that are making already kind of construction of technologies out of intervening those discussions, like bringing, for instance, celebrities to say what is the position that they could take in that discussion. And those arguments are part of the making of a way of doing politics that, for me, is also very interesting and in which architecture is playing key roles. I will only tell you about one of them because there are so many. But this is the garden, and at some point we had to react because the bishop wanted a French garden. And we said, yeah, but the French garden is not one with parterres and things, but it's like May 68 garden, we said, which is so French. So we produced this May 68 garden, which was basically, I mean, it was kind of a silly thing to put it, but what we did is we did these numbers, and we give each person or each apartment here a number, so they would have the responsibility of taking decisions on the piece of land that was related to their numbers, but we never defined the limits of those parcels, they say, of those lots. So actually the definition of the limits and the paths to get there would be something that they would have to discuss. I mean, this is a very basic thing, but it was just bringing an opportunity for a discussion to be there. In a place like an elder residency that tend to be designed to actually prevent debate from happening. We were, for instance, discussing with the director of an elder residency, and he was telling us, if you're going to design one of these residencies, you only have to know one thing. The switchers need to be away from people's touch. If they reach the switcher, you will have a debate on whether the lights should be on or off. And believe me, you don't want a debate in an elder residency. So actually, we were doing the opposite. We were trying to bring debate to daily life. And yeah, this is the people living there after a year. So we went back and we studied what had happened, and this was the people. Actually, this guy is not posing to give scale to the photograph, but he's watching us because he's in charge of these gardens here. And you see here, he's got the first crop, so he was really much concerned that we could do something bad to those things. Actually, we were tracing one of the controversies that he was involved with. And it was a basic one, but very interesting for me. Like this guy, the first plot that he had was by the entrance, here. There's some nuns' apartments here in the blue ones. And he had this plot here. So he decided to plant onions, and that was considered by some of the people, these people here, not so nice to have it in the entrance. So they would prefer something else, like flowers, and which was much more proper to, let's say, welcome visitors. Actually, they were very convincing with their arguments, so they gained the support of 2 other people, and together there were 4 people against this guy over here. But of course, he had the right to take decisions, so he was still with the onions. And at one point, they were developing new arguments. Like, for instance, they did a new argument, like, this guy is kind of old. I mean, they all are old, but this is particularly old. And they thought that onions were kind of requiring so much care. And in case he was not that well anymore, who could take care of the onions? Whereas the flowers, supposedly, are easier. So if in case he's not able to take care of them, they would grow naturally beautifully, and the onions wouldn't. So they had another argument, but he made a very good move, and he got permission from other people to do things in their plots, and by doing that, somehow he became powerful, because he would be just not dealing with one plot, with onions, but with 5 of them. And also, he gained the support of the people that were owning those plots by telling them that if they were supporting him, he would share the crop with them. But this bunch of people, they were very intelligent and very fast. So they found an expert. You know, the ultimate problem solver, the expert. So any controversy, as you know, ends with the opinion of an expert that could say, like in this case, this retired professional gardener, that the criteria of these people was totally professional. Like from an expert point of view, it was true that at the entrance you would never put onions. You were supposed to do, I mean, from a very professional and expert perspective point of view, whatever, you are supposed to put flowers. So they were kind of gaining the battle, but the battle was still open because, of course, he had the right to have the onions. I mean, this is a tiny story, and we could trace it, and this is all the people involved here. So in a way, I would propose this kind of rendering of the social, one in which happy endings are not required, and in which even architecture could bring micropolitics to daily life, or could help producing it. And the final one, a Scarbox, a case of associative. Well, this sounds now too bad. Okay, this Scarbox. I would like to finish with this one, because for me it's also kind of a funny thing. It's a project that we did 2 years ago, and of which we've seen already how it works. The Scarbox is kind of the result of an experiment. We were invited to do something in a big square in Madrid that is so open and it's got no trees or shades or whatever. But they use that square for many different purposes. They do fairs, they do concerts, they do markets. And anything that they tried to use to bring shade there is kind of compromising the flexibility of the space. So we were asked to do something there that could bring shade there without compromising or without, let's say, removing the flexibility of the actual big square. But we were doing something else at the same time that no one requested. We were thinking that this is the distribution, this is the community of Madrid, the kind of the metropolis of Madrid, and this is the distribution of, let's say, cultural centers in the city, like the main ones. Whereas this is the distribution of the most important places for, let's say, creation or cultural speculation. As you see, the distribution is very different, whereas this one tends to be aligned with the excess of the most expensive real estate zones. This one is kind of much more homogeneously distributed. Could we do something to bring these two networks together? We were thinking that these devices that we were designing could at the same time cater to this situation in which the square could be provided with shade, but without compromising its flexibility by doing it, let's say, mobile things that could be equipped with engines that would allow them to be moved once it's necessary and to, let's say, adapt them to a series of different situations and requirements. And at the same time, we could equip them in a way with all these things. They could provide opportunities for people to develop or to carry some of their creative or speculative cultural work to that space without being invited by the institution. You see here how they were moving. This is in this studio, in the office, and we were marking the floor plan of the square, and we were kind of seeing how they could adapt to that, which was not that easy. And this is the first one, which is called Scarbox Lux, because it's got mainly equipment that relates to video beams, monitors, things that have to do with image. And it looks like this. We were producing them by recombining already massively produced, already existing, massively produced or mass-produced technologies that we were customizing and reassembling together to produce this in a very inexpensive way. This is the way it looks. But it could never work. I mean, we could never explain without this kind of drawings that we have to produce in which we see how, in a way, it gets to be performing. And it could never work without the association of a number of very heterogeneous devices, furniture, but also website, blogs. Many of them were not designed by us, but others we were kind of taking the responsibility of doing them. This is the other one, a Scarbox Sonum, which is more about sound, microphones, speakers, amplifiers. And again, this is kind of the situation that we were trying to achieve. And this was the technology that we were using. Those were the mass-produced components that were designed for other purposes, all of them. Like this was an irrigating structure. This was one of these things for building sites to put the garbage there. This is this thing that is used by agriculture. When you see the prices are really ridiculous, so we could do all these things with each of them a price of 50,000 euros. So the two of them, 100,000 euros. This is the way we reassemble them and customize them. This is the furniture we designed. That was super important. That was also movable. This is many things. But as I said, this kind of set of different, again, a heterogeneous association of objects could never work or could never have worked with other things, like, for instance, that we never designed, like, for instance, the blogs in which all the experiences happening here were recorded and broadcasted and discussed. Or, for instance, something very particular that they hired this collective, the Colectivo Ja, a group of people that during the first summer, they were using intensively in very different ways the devices so people of the city could see or could have samples of how they could end up using the Scarbox as kind of a training for people to get a know-how on how these devices could be associated with their practices. This is the way they look already in use. This is in the morning. You see all these devices, and they get moved all the time. This is already at night, and there's a series of different events like that I brought today. Like, for instance, this kind of lecture. People were presenting some research work here, or this one, which is kind of many things happening at the same time. Or this funny thing of this guy throwing knives, and this copla singing that brought together people of very different ages. And with this, I would like to finish. Thank you so much.
Questions?
Complaints also.
So who has the first complaint?
Not yet.
I think that in the Scarbox you show very well like the intention of your project. No, I mean how you put together the institutionalized spaces for culture and the spaces that are more informal that operate cultivating and producing culture. No, so I mean you create this architectural artifact that puts them all together in some sort of informal, teaching the public how to use them kind of way, no? So I was thinking, this works? I don't know if it works any longer. Okay. So I was thinking that what would be then like a similar proposal for the domestic space? Because I think that in all of the projects that you have shown, and you haven't shown this one, for instance, no, that you have in the poster, you identify very well certain technologies that highlight the possibilities for conflict, for instance, but we don't see exactly like a similar kind of proposal, no? What would be the disciplinary or non-disciplinary conversation that we should have in terms of proposals if you talk about domesticity?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I didn't want to do it so long, so I didn't want to, you know, this thing that I always want to bring every project to the lectures, but then I see that people get sleeping, so... But for instance, we did a project that it would be perfect to answer you. It's called the Tupper Home. You know, Tupper Homes project. The Tupper Homes project was actually dealing exactly with that. It was a catalog of, let's say, components that anyone could use to transform their homes. And we were actually dealing with the experience of the demonstrative marketing, the Tupperware tradition, and we were doing it with the license of Tupperware. I mean, they were trying to sue us, so at some point we had to deal with them, and because we were saying Tupper Homes, and they say, well, Tupper Homes, yeah, we have the name. So in that case, what we were doing is to design a series of components, similar to the toys that I showed about the Placentia building. And we were producing these catalogs, so people could buy them and discuss them, because they were open source objects. We were actually providing the name and telephone of the guy who could produce them, and they could have a conversation with them and transform them. But using the design as, let's say, a generic design that could be the base of that discussion, in which they already have what the cost was, because there was kind of a commitment of these producers of keeping the cost for a certain time. With that, what we were trying to do is the same that was happening at homes with the Tupperware tradition, that the experiments was brought to the interior of the homes, and that by demonstrating things, like when you show your home to your friends once you've renovated it, you start a conversation that somehow could be gained as potential to develop architecture and to enroll users into a common discussion in which the renovation of these devices could be somehow counting on their participation as well. This was a very particularly good project. We got to do the first one, and the family was really amazing because they were kind of showing the house to all their friends. And by doing that, they started to really produce those components in, let's say, funny versions that at some point were really kind of crazy, but they were actually representing or putting on the table many of the evolutions that those objects could have and those technologies. The outcome of that architecture was not actually the objects themselves, the components, but the whole discussion that brought together all these people and that somehow was producing kind of a society based on the common discussion and experimentation of those technologies. So we tend to think that the outcome of architecture is providing kind of functional possibilities. But what it is, what would it be if actually we were looking to the wrong place? And that what if the actual discussion of how those things perform, the architectural device, was becoming much more important than the actual use of them. For me, that's something that we could see in this Tupperware experience or Herbalife or Avon in a very, let's say, seminal way or let's say tiny way, but with, as Norge Marves is studied, in blogs like how to make your home sustainable or in all sorts of discussions like the ones that are around the organic food baskets, you know, all this. This is kind of becoming a new possibility that for me is also very interesting. Actually not new because it's something that is coming with technology all the time, but actually from the way that these phenomena are studied, we could learn that maybe that could be the outcome also of architecture. At least that's the one I'm very much interested in working with. Yeah.
How do you think this syntactical element and the way you use color, material, and form deals with this political stance?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it because, well, the first thing that I must say is that I could never say that the result is a direct, let's say, outcome of the things that I'm explaining. So it's related to that, but part of the process is unknown by myself or by all the people working in that. So probably there's kind of material that comes from the references that we altogether many people get to like or wherever or are inclined to. So I think that's also important to say. So part of it is maybe the context in which we're working. But I would suggest that when we go to the detail, all these decisions have been part of a complex, critical, let's say, process in which somehow they were selected and they were discussed with other alternatives, so they succeed of being the final one selected. In the case, for instance, let's go to a very particular thing. In the case of the stripes here, that was very much the result of many discussions. There was a need somehow to have very inexpensive materials, like this one, and we could actually we could never find a better one than this fabric, because it's super cheap or inexpensive, and in a way, it's having a very good performance. So it removes 90% of the sun, but it's very light. It lets the air go through. It fulfills all the requirements, actually, because it was developed for something very similar. But we had to choose between a very limited number of colors and patterns. One was black, other was green, other was gray, and then this was the other one. So let's say that when we put them on the table, the kind of communicational requirements that we found that were important for this device kind of being seen as available were thought to be better fulfilled by this thing with the stripes. When it was working, actually many people say it's like the beach. So it brought new meanings that we were not thinking of, and that made this atmosphere, especially in summer, kind of celebrated by people. What makes me think that the way many of these things perform are kind of producing kind of a communicational strategy that makes them be seen as available, also as controversial in many aspects, so they're kind of soft and open to the discussion, also kind of celebrating daily life, or at least moving or making a mood for people to celebrate. And these are mainly the things related to color. But I must say that when we were working for the press, for instance, it was they who were asking for colors. So they said the first thing that we did, it was black and white drawings, like architectural drawings, and they said the vicario económico, I don't know how to translate it, like the priest in charge of money. He said, oh, we old people, we need color. We see it all black, so we need colors. And so at the end, when he saw the color, he said, well, you went too far. But we said, yeah, but it was you who asked for the color. So you have to be careful with what you say. Yeah. Yeah, Mabel.
I think it's a really stunning presentation, and the work is just gorgeous, so I just want to say thank you for sharing. But I was curious about the political innovation within the work, and also there's something about the work that I find really fascinating about negotiation, and the ways in which your projects are very much about mediation. And the narrative you told about the priest, the narrative you told about the garden, I just thought was fantastic. And it made me start to think about the problem of, you could say sort of domestic conflict, but domestic conflict at the scale of, you could say terrorism, for example, right? Because it's usually about internal, that it's not really nation against nation, but it has to do with internal conflict. And whether or not, the work that you've done starts to perhaps begin to address that scale of mediation, or that form of mediation. I went with a group of students a couple of years ago to meet with a guy named Karn Ross, who runs something called Independent Diplomat, precisely because, he was a diplomat for the UK, and he recognized that conflict is not between wars are not between nation states anymore. They're actually always internal conflicts. And so there's a question of domestic conflict, I think, that your work is also potentially addressing, but it might be at multiple scales, if not, kind of a larger scale. So I'm wondering if there's anything within the body of work that you've produced that you didn't necessarily show that maybe begins to address some of those questions.
Yeah, well, it's an amazing question, and I could suggest that this is something so important, and we're working on that at several, let's say, scales and from different formats. And actually, exactly what you're saying, precisely what you're saying, is being also kind of forcing, let's say, us to move into formats that we are not so mastered on. Like, for instance, this opera that you were mentioning, and also, for instance, the IKEA project and many others. Let's say that domestic space is kind of like the key arena for so many things. Gender issues, economical issues, technological issues, landscape issues. So many different, let's say, shared realities are discussed in living rooms, or in bedrooms, or in bathrooms, or in closets. And actually, not only that, but in the way domesticity is produced kind of in the association of many different things that are not necessarily things that we consider homes. Delivering energy, power stations, or, I don't know, fiction, media. Many of these realities can be very much confronted in the way domesticity is performed. But to become kind of active in those things, new formats need to be developed. When we were thinking, for instance, of IKEA, we saw that IKEA is probably now the most important architectural agent. Much more important than Rem Koolhaas or David Copperfield or, I don't know, who's the most important architect? I don't know, Zaha Hadid, whoever, I don't know. So it's much more important if you think of the possibility of transforming daily life for so many people. The IKEA catalog was printed in a broader number than the Bible last year, and it was translated to more languages. So actually their impact in the making of daily life is huge. And actually they're provoking, or they're fostering ideologies that somehow requires some kind of answer or respond. The activism against these ideas is something that somehow is already part of the daily experience of architecture. And by designing, let's say, in a very particular way, it's very difficult to address those issues. Somehow, it's also important to account that the discipline has also other tools to deal with these things, like bringing discourse, discussion in a different way, to making things visible in a different way, to producing new ways of explaining things, to kind of producing an indirect transformation of the way daily life is performed when it comes to, let's say, producing design. We also did, so we worked on that way to actually make something that in a relevant way could phrase the discourses that were so effective on producing daily life. And I would consider that the number of works that we know all of us that were produced, for instance, by people like Cedric Price, like the work he did in this first, in which he was doing he was putting wrongly the dimension of architectural elements in a city, like the chimney was 2 meters, and everyone knew that it was 20 meters. And this was actually giving a reference of this way of doing architecture in which the discussion is really the outcome, and the production of daily life is probably an indirect result of that discussion, which can only be produced from the architecture in a way because involving so much expert knowledge. Recently we did another work that was this opera that is called Superpowers of 10. And we were doing a version, like, you know, these funny versions that they do in YouTube, of the Powers of 10 movie by the Inns. Because, of course, the Powers of 10 movie was kind of an architectural product, and it was producing reality in a very particular way, but it was also producing it by, let's say, not engaging in debates that are currently super important. So if we want to do a, let's say, cover version, contemporary cover version of this movie that I much love, of course, we could then include all the parts that were left behind in this frame, and in which architecture is also challenged now. From gender issues like why this direct identification of genes and the image of gender in the hand of the man is so automatically presented, or to things like, for instance, what is that they mean when they say our neighborhoods? Who is this ours? What are those neighborhoods? What are those other things that are not included in that frame? Actually, to see how in a version of that, I would call architectural device, the Powers of 10, what could be the contemporary version, funny version in this case, of that one, would also, in my opinion, would engaging with architectural goals or possibilities that our discipline are making available. And with that, I think those politics that you're talking about, in which there are multi-scalar realities, and that all this complexity of the in or domestic politics, I think that could also be addressed. But your question is always, I mean, it's much better than any answer. So it's much more complex and broader than our experience. So.
In the first point that you made, you gave agency to the tchotchkes, to all these decorations and objects within the houses, and you say that they have political agency and that we can encounter that in the interiors. And my question is, in early 20th century discourse, for instance, in Walter Benjamin, he was thinking about the bourgeois interior and like objects and furniture as something that was constraining and that was preventing people from advancing in a way. And at first in the IKEA Disobedients project, I thought you were looking at some sector of society in particular, but then when you go to Los Angeles, you look at houses across the board, no? From different social strata, if you will, or income level. So I'm not so clear, what do you mean when you say that these objects, decorations, tchotchkes, when they have agency, political agency? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. I think it's important to think what is the agency of objects. And when we consider the agency of, there's a whole debate on, for instance, Robert Moses And the British, Landon Winner brought this issue on do artifacts have politics, and then it was responded, do politics have artifacts, and then many things. That discussion is very interesting for me because when you see the decoration or devices of any kind or technologies, they all have some intentions in them, or let's say during their production there's a number of intentions that get to be influencing the design. The performance of those intentions is not direct and it's never, let's say, total. So they could even reprogram. So we all now have this image in mind of Sis with the swastika, and he was reprogramming the performance of this sign by using it in a different way. I could suggest that all these technologies are charged with intention that is kind of produced during the process of making them, but it's not finished yet. And by the way they get associated with other things and the way they get to be performed, the outcome could be very different. But still, there's an agency involved in those objects. We could interpret the meaning of many of the stories that they contain, and we could trace where they come from and what was the society that was producing them. But for me, it's very important, the notion of shared agency. So when you see in detail all these things, the political effect or construction is kind of the result of all these interactions. This is very difficult to account because basically it's saying that technology can never be seen isolated. It's not autonomous at all. And when I mean technology, I use this word to put at the same level, let's say, buildings with cell phones. And it means also that the account is also kind of provisional, and that design is also something that, in a way, from my perspective or from my interest, is something that never finished and not necessarily needs to be carried on by the same designers or whatever, but is kind of reproduced by others and others after others, and not necessarily all of them people, but also transformations of landscape or softwares or wherever. So when we see these bourgeois interiors, many of them, they remain and they're used by other people and they have a different effect. So the same buildings that were, this is a very funny example, like the same mews, for instance, that were used for the servers, for the house in Victorian times, for instance, they're now super expensive and they're for rich people. So the same kind of architecture is being reprogrammed by a new reassociation of it. And the political effect, whereas in the past it was kind of segregating in classes, now it's producing kind of another segregation in a different way that is not really associating the mews to the, let's say, hub, but to rich people, similar rich people to the one that is living in the main house. So that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you for a really, really excellent talk and so many provocative projects. My question is about the way that you see architecture as a practice and the kind of tools you use. A lot of the work is very interrogative, no? It's asking questions about space, but you obviously have a very social approach. So my question is, do you work with sociologists? How do you come with this knowledge, not just from the anecdotal perspective, but maybe from a more formal point of view, whether that's something that you work in an interdisciplinary way with ethnographers or sociologists, anthropologists, or whether that's something that you think could be applied more kind of systematically to architecture in general? Because I think that you have some insights which are really amazing that not every architect has, no?
Yeah, we work actually, if I go to the first image, too many. Part of a team are not architects. So for instance, this girl, Sylvia, that is right, she's a sociologist. And I really like the whole tradition of sociology when it comes to material account, because it brings so many opportunities. Now, I must say that also we engage so much in techniques that are mainly part of the tradition of the social anthropology, but not really. because I've learned those things many times talking with friends, like sociologist friends, and I'm now part of a research group that is mainly part of the Faculty of Sociology in Madrid. But I must say that I could say that these things are part of our discipline. So to find how, in the boundaries of our discipline, there's already a huge capital for these interactions is very important for me. So when you think of the conversations that Neutra was having with his clients, it's something that is very interesting for me, all the conversations of Cedric Price with many people. And many of the things that we even consider kind of accidents in our disciplines could, oh, we're closer. We could see that are part of those traditions. So I could say that yes in a way and not in a way. So on the one hand, I could say that of course I've been working so much with sociologists and people from political sciences. I love to read texts by Garfinkel or by many other people. But also I think that there's a whole tradition in which architecture is engaging with this challenge of the boundaries and the use of these kind of technologies to, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know I put so many photographs here, the slides, so, but we'll So could we think of the work of people like Le Corbusier without thinking of the movies that he was doing? And could we think of the work of Neutra without considering also the way he was developing techniques to deal with the conversation of his clients? Could we think of Cedric Price without thinking that the projects in which he was doing devices to make things transparent are not architecture? That could be very violent. So I could say that those boundaries that I really very much I'm willing to challenge, and I do by getting close to these disciplines, are also part of our discipline. So let's say there's a whole history of promiscuity, and we can make the best of it. I'm sorry, I'm still not there, but I will show Sylvia to you. Here it comes. It's almost there. Here it is. That's Sylvia. And Pablo Le, there was another guy before Sylvia.
So yeah. I mean, since the one thing we have to now avoid is the happy ending. So I kind of like the idea that the audience has to watch the lecture in reverse. Also because a lot of your analysis has to do with repetition and the kind of cycle. But to say the obvious, Andrés is one of the most thoughtful architects on the planet and of the planet. And one interesting assignment for you would be, since you have an impossibly rich palette of projects, like it always seems impossible that you're doing so many things, but you could analyze lecture theatres because you see that group there. That's like an island of people. It's very solid. It's like a social grouping. Whereas on the side to the right, they were very vulnerable and they dispersed. And all the questions were asked on the corridor. So either people sit in this corridor because they're from the beginning poised to ask questions, or and that's why they're on axis with you. See, they're right. So I think the whole scene of the lecture could be thought through. And I know that you shouldn't listen to my analysis of it, but I think I'm standing here, I get to sort of see it. There's a lot of solidarity always over there. And you sit over there because you're not going to ask a question, never ask a question. You're going to be a voyeur. You're going to look at the audience. This is not the audience. This is like a box seat watching. So he would analyze all of this and figure it all out. But I think your observation that the ambition of design would be conversation, like would be discussion and not happy ending, is actually a terrorist. It has a sort of terrorist impact on architectural discourse, which is determined for the happy ending as a monument that will silently stand there in place of conversation. And I notice that you always use this expression of putting things on the table, which is already, I think, a bit of a domestic. It's a Tupperware thing, right? You put the stuff on the table. So I think this idea that architecture itself is going to get put on the table and thought about and talked about is super interesting, which is why it's really a pleasure to listen to you always, and to know that you're here as a colleague teaching. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.